Thank you, John. Darrin Qualman is a farmer. He farmed for 2 decades at his family farm in Saskatchewan. Darrin is also a researcher and data analyst who likes to think about the big picture. In 2019, he published a book, Civilization Critical: Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future. The same year, he released the report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, a transformative strategy for Canadian farms and food systems. Going back a bit further, from 1996 to 2010, he was a primary researcher and writer for the National Farmers Union. Darrin is currently the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action for the National Farmers Union. Regarding his time at the NFU, I have it on good authority that he was responsible for a whole bunch of really important, insightful briefs and research papers that have had widespread influence across the country. Darrin is with us today to talk about the climate crisis in the context of our food systems. I'm not going to say much more because that's what he's here for. Please join me in at least visually welcoming our 2021 keynote speaker, Darrin Qualman. And Darrin, as you're getting organized, I just want to say we are running late, but I've built that into our day here. We have plenty of chance to catch up, so you don't need to adjust your speech whatsoever, given that we're a little behind. We'll catch up later. Darrin, take it away.
Thank you, Jordan. Thanks for that great introduction. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Okay, good. And I managed to get the cat filter off, so that's a good start. I'll just share my screen here. And while I'm doing that, I just want to thank Minister Popham as well. Those were wonderful and very inspiring comments. So thanks to her as well. Okay, Jordan, is my PowerPoint up? Okay, great. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. Thanks for everyone for coming out this morning, and really pleased to be speaking today at the Certified Organic Associations of British Columbia. My talk is Energy Problems and Organic Agriculture Solutions. My talk is going to start out seeming to have a real focus on the problems around climate change, but do not despair from the bad news. I'm going to transition into solutions. We need to understand the problem, but we need to understand the problem so that we can make changes, reduce emissions, and really move toward a different kind of agriculture. And I really love the theme of the conference today, Embracing Change. Climate change is going to cause a lot of change within the system. And I think that if we as farmers get in the lead and take some control of that change process, there can be some positives coming out of this along the way. So just before I get into my talk itself, I just want to say a little bit about where you can find more information on some of the things I'm talking about here today. On the NFU website are 3 two-pagers. If you want just a brief introduction to some of this, one is on 8 things you need to know about climate change. Another one is 8 things you can do on your farm. Another one is how you can help advance policy work. And for really detailed information on some of the things I'm talking about today, there's the 100-page report that we released last year called Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis. So just before I get into the presentation itself, I just want to recap some of the really good news, because often we don't take the time to focus on the solutions that we've managed to put in place, some of the progress we've made. Farmers for Climate Solutions is a coalition. It was founded 1 year ago. I see our Zena is on the Zoom meeting here. She's been doing wonderful work as chair of the Farmers for Climate Solutions Task Force. Farm Folk, City Folk has been really key to all of this as well. So thanks to everyone who's been part of the Farmers for Climate Solutions Coalition. FCS and the National Farmers Union have been meeting with ministers in recent months. Farmers for Climate Solutions really had a coup when they got agriculture and climate change into the throne speech. And following on from that, Farmers for Climate Solutions and the other coalition partners got agriculture and climate into the mandate letter for the Federal Minister of Agriculture, put that at the center of Minister Bibeau's priority list. In December of 2020, the federal government released a new climate plan, and that included a very specific commitment to reduce emissions from nitrogen fertilizer by 30%. That's a very important step. And just to say that all of this climate work is important in its own right, but the climate change issue is also a way, something that we can use as a lever to redirect agriculture policy in general. What we often say is the changes that climate change forces us to make open the door for a lot of the very positive changes that we want to make. So the climate change work is important, but it's also, it fits into a larger policy discussion and a set of policy initiatives to make agriculture better, more sustainable, more resilient across Canada. So my talk today is going to have 5 parts. I'm going to start by talking about global emissions from all sources. Then I'm going to focus in and talk about agricultural emissions, specifically from British Columbia. I'm going to talk a bit about nitrogen, how it creates a climate problem, but also how organic agriculture shows the way to some solutions around nitrogen. I'll talk about some other solutions, low input agriculture for those who aren't organic, food sheds, independent agrologists, alternative energy, etc. And then I'll finish by connecting together the emissions solutions to income solutions. So just to start off, to give you a bit of an overview of the global situation, why is it critical that we take dramatic steps in agriculture in every sector in order to avert the worst versions of the climate crisis? So as some of you will know, there are 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. I'm just going to look briefly at where we are on all. I'm just going to look briefly at where we are on all 3 of those. This first graph is carbon dioxide concentrations in Earth's atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. 800,000 years is a long time. It's about 4 times longer than human beings have existed on the planet in our current form. And just 2 things in that graph. The units aren't important, but what's important is kind of the general shape. And I'll just highlight 2 things. One, for 800,000 to 1 million years, CO2 levels in the atmosphere went up and they went down, but never once did they peak above 300 parts per million. 300 parts per million is kind of the long-term maximum record high. We're at about 410 parts per million right now. We're probably headed for 500. So concentrations today are higher than at any time in the last 800,000 or 1 million years, maybe longer. Second thing is just how fast they're rising. That spike looks vertical, and I hope you can see my cursor down there, just down at the bottom. That is the low point in carbon dioxide concentrations at the end of the last ice age. And between that period and 1900, CO2 concentrations went up by about 100 parts per million. And then they went up by another 100 parts per million between 1900 and 2021. But notice that the first increase of 100 parts per million took 10,000 years, and the recent one took only 100. So not only are CO2 concentrations higher than they've ever been, they're increasing about 100 times faster than they have over the long term. Second major greenhouse gas is methane. Methane is about 28 times more powerful than CO2 in trapping heat. Major sources of methane include landfills, oil and gas production, fossil fuel production, rice paddy agriculture, and grazing livestock. And the time frame on this graph is a little shorter. It's only 10,000 years, kind of short term. But you can see for about 98% of that time, methane concentrations were stable and flat at around 600 parts per million. And then in the last 100 or 200 years, we've tripled them to about 1,800 parts per million. Very dramatic increase, very troubling trend. Nitrous oxide, the third major greenhouse gas. For agriculture, the main source here is nitrogen fertilizer. also manure, but largely nitrogen fertilizer. Again, 800,000 years of data. It goes up and it goes down, but levels today are much higher than they have been over the last 800,000 to 1 million years. So if the three main greenhouse gases, the concentrations in the atmosphere are rising, not surprisingly, so too are temperatures. This is a scatter graph of the last 140 years. You can see that there wasn't much change into, say, maybe the 1970s or 1980s. And then there's a very strong and distinct upward trend line. It looks like we're pushing past 1 degree globally. And in some of the recent years, we're closer to 1.5 degrees. When we look at the UN GAPS report that's published each year, that report assesses all of the commitments, all of the programs, all of the steps that have been announced, and it tries to tell what we can expect for warming. For the last 2 or 3 years, each year when that report came out, the answer was always the same, that even with carbon taxes and electric vehicle rebates and the commitments that Canada and others made in Paris in 2015, even with all of those things taken into account, the planet is on track for 3.2 degrees of warming. That's much higher than the 1.5 degrees that was agreed to in Paris, much higher than the 2 degrees that many say is sort of the line between bad and very, very bad. Even given everything we've done, we are still on track for 3.2 degrees. So that means we have to do more. We have to make and meet more ambitious targets. We have to really move forward with much more energy and ambition. So that's a look at the global situation, atmospheric concentrations and temperatures. I now want to focus in on agriculture and specifically British Columbia. So this is a graph of British Columbia agricultural greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2018. It includes all the different kinds of emissions. Often when you look at Government of Canada data, it omits a number of kinds of emissions. It omits emissions from on-farm fuel use, from the production of nitrogen fertilizer, etc. What we've done is we've assembled a complete data set that includes all of those kinds of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the complete picture for British Columbia farms. And I'll just walk you through, starting at the bottom. The dark blue is emissions from soil, and that's largely nitrogen fertilizer. Light blue is CO2 from the production of nitrogen fertilizer. The tan bar, not very wide, that's things like lime and urea, the carbon dioxide from those fertilizers. Then there's a little bit energy embodied in machinery. The red band is energy use on the farm, and that's largely diesel fuel. If we were in a different province, we'd see emissions from the production of electricity, but the electricity supply in BC is quite clean, so we don't see that so much. The red is diesel fuel emissions, also some natural gas and gasoline. The dark green is enteric methane, the methane that comes out of the mouths of cattle when they digest grass. And the light green at the very top is manure management. So that's cattle manure, but also chicken, pigs, sheep, all various animals, all the various types of manure. Not the stuff that's dropped on pastures, should say, but rather stuff that's collected together, stored, and then applied. So you can see at the bottom, nitrogen fertilizer makes up a big chunk, cattle make up a bigger chunk. The data here is lagging a little bit, and when we look more at nitrogen, you'll see that that's a larger and growing area, a little larger than it shows here, because this data only captures to 2018, and there's been quite a jump in nitrogen fertilizer use in BC in the last couple of years. So when we graph BC emissions, we can see the top line goes up and down. That's largely a function of the herd size in the province. You can see on the left is a graph of how many cattle there are, and that shape of that line largely matches the shape of the top line in the emissions. So the two big drivers are the number of cattle in the province and the amount of nitrogen fertilizer being used on farms that use that fertilizer. And I know as organic producers, you found ways to farm without that. And that's why when I turn to solutions, I'll talk a little bit more about how important those processes are and those practices are, and how we need to take those practices wherein you can farm without nitrogen and proliferate those to non-organic farms. I just want to say a bit about soil carbon sequestration. A lot of people point to sequestration as kind of a get out of jail free card for agriculture and emissions. And I will say, I'll start by saying that soil carbon building is tremendously important. Restoring soil carbon levels in our agricultural soils is absolutely critical. It increases fertility, it increases water holding capacity, it gets the biology working. It's absolutely critical. Soil carbon building is a soil health solution. What it isn't, however, is a climate change solution. It isn't possible, as some would suggest, to take a huge portion of the CO2 currently in the atmosphere and sequester it in soils. The carbon from fossil fuels just cannot be put into the soils. What we can probably do is return to the soil the carbon that was in the soil when we first started farming it, but we can't return all that carbon and a significant portion of the carbon from fossil fuel. So this graph on the right is produced by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and it's the brown bars pointing up are the emissions from agriculture. The gold bars facing down are carbon sequestration in cropland. You can see that they're relatively modest compared to the emissions, and you can see that they're getting smaller. And the reason they're getting smaller is over time, agricultural soils move back toward a carbon equilibrium. They move back toward the level of carbon they had probably before people started farming. So you can put a lot of carbon back into the soil, and that's absolutely critical, but you cannot just endlessly put more and more and more back in. You reach some limits. So happy to answer more questions about sequestration in the question and answer. So I want to talk about nitrogen fertilizer, partly because it's such a huge emissions problem in agriculture, and partly because it's something that organic agriculture is really an example for how to solve that problem. So these two graphs show nitrogen fertilizer tonnage in British Columbia and in Canada. And I mentioned that the increases in BC, there's been quite significant increases in recent years. So the graph on the left shows the last 52 years, I think it would be. In BC, you can see that it increased in the 1960s, 70s, early 80s. It was coming down, but in the last few years has gone up quite dramatically. Again, an upward trend line there. And in Canada as a whole, you can see a very strong upward trend line. A lot of that's driven by fertilizer tonnage on the prairies. In the province where I live and for many years farmed, we've quadrupled nitrogen fertilizer use since the 1990s. A lot of people would have us believe that things like zero-till are ways to reduce input use. But during the zero-till era here in Saskatchewan, we've quadrupled nitrogen fertilizer use. So these are a couple of graphs of Canadian emissions and Canadian fertilizer use, just to kind of show you how that fertilizer use is driving Canadian emissions as a whole. So on the right, you see overall Canadian emissions, and the top line goes up, but it goes up not because of more emissions from cattle or for increasing emissions from fuel. That top line is going up because there's more and more greenhouse gases coming each year from the production and use of nitrogen fertilizer. The green bands at the bottom, you can see the upward trend there, and that more or less matches the graph on the left, which is the tonnage of nitrogen fertilizer being used in Canada. So when we ask the question, why are Canadian agricultural emissions rising? The answer is nitrogen fertilizer. And when we ask the question, what's the focus, what's the most important thing to change in Canada, it's that we need to get that nitrogen line flat and moving downward. Some of you will know, but nitrogen is a fossil fuel product. The main feedstock is natural gas, and it really, really is energy intensive. By the time you get a ton of nitrogen fertilizer onto a field, the energy that went into creating and transporting and applying that ton of fertilizer is equal to 2 tons of gasoline. We're literally taking fossil fuel calories from the ground, creating nitrogen fertilizer, pushing it into the food system, and pushing increased food calories out the other end. Now, I mentioned organic agriculture is a real solution here. Organic farmers have found ways through more complex rotations, intercropping, legumes, etc. They found ways to farm without nitrogen fertilizer. These are practices that we need to move into non-organic farms. We need to get all farms doing this sort of thing. And we need to multiply the acreage of organic agriculture, the number of organic farms. We need to make sure that other farmers start paying attention to those practices that allow farmers to farm without nitrogen fertilizer. Something, by the way, that farmers did for 9,900 years. And it's only the last 100 or so that we've become massively dependent on chemical fertilizers. We need to diversify approaches in Canada, more agroecology, holistic management, best possible grazing, etc. And the other thing we need to do is we just need to increase the number of farmers on the land. And this is more on the adaptation and resilience side than on the emission reduction side, although it helps there too. But the current trend in Canada, where each year we have fewer and fewer farmers, is really negative when it comes to climate change adaptation. If you're in a rapidly changing climate and rapidly changing ecosystems, the more people you can have on the landscape, the better. The more eyes, the more observers, the more judgment, the more care and attention you can have, the better. And by pursuing agricultural policies that push people off the land, we're really eroding our capacity to adapt. We're really eroding our resilience. So one of the things that organic agriculture does as well, unlike very large conventional operations, is organic agriculture can help us maintain and increase the number of people on the landscape. And that's really, really key to climate change adaptation and resilience. So just in terms of the nitrogen problem, in terms of non-organic farmers, the farmers that are using nitrogen, there's really 3 things we need to focus on: efficiency, reduction, and production. So in terms of efficiency, we need to embrace what's called the 4R nitrogen best management practices. So farmers who are using nitrogen, you need to use the right formulation at the right rate, put it in the right place, and do that at the right time. And by doing that, they can be more efficient with the nitrogen, and the nitrogen they use can produce fewer emissions. But efficiency isn't enough. We've been using resources more efficiently on Earth for hundreds of years, yet we're using more and more resources. So in addition to just efficiency, we need to be very intentional about reducing tonnage. We need independent soil testing rather than relying on fertilizer sellers to test soils. We need independent government labs to do that. We maybe need a tax on fertilizer, maybe 2 or 3%, and then take that money, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars, and flow it into research to help farmers use less fertilizer and to find alternatives to purchase fertilizer. And we need reduction targets, like the one that the government of Canada announced in December, a 30% reduction in emissions from fertilizer, but they also need to be more ambitious than that. But we need real targets. We need to make sure that those trend lines for nitrogen, fertilizer, and emissions that were going up are bent downward. And finally, if we're going to use this fertilizer, we need to produce it without emissions. So we need to use alternative energy, and we need to capture the carbon coming off of those fertilizer plants, which are huge. In Manitoba, for instance, the largest single source of greenhouse gases in the entire province is a fertilizer plant owned and run by the Koch brothers. So I just want to talk a little bit more about solutions. So when we are doing our policy development at the National Farmers Union, we really focus on the incredible contributions in terms of emissions reduction from organic farmers, agroecological farmers, etc. But we also recognize that in the near term, most farmers aren't going to be organic. But for these farmers, we are advocating what we call minimum input no-till, MINT agriculture, and that's a hybrid system. And we believe that if we took the best ideas from organic agriculture, ways to reduce fertilizer use, alternatives to chemical pesticides, and combine those with the best ideas from zero-till, maybe some strategic use of chemicals and fertilizers, we could dramatically reduce the emissions per kilogram or ton of output, grain output. So organic agriculture really is a source of ideas, and these ideas need to be brought to the fore, and we need to create hybrid systems in non-organic agriculture where the best ideas of organic are blended with the best ideas from no-till and conventional, so that we're very intentional about reducing emissions while we maintain yields. We call that MINT agriculture, minimum input no-till. Another part of the solution is we need to reduce emissions from fuel use on farms, carbon dioxide from the use of diesel, gasoline, natural gas, propane, electricity production where in places where that produces emissions. So we need to electrify everything possible because electricity can be a source of low emission energy. We need to electrify water and building heat. We need to electrify trucks and tractors. There's a lot of electric pickup trucks coming. I'm sensitive to the fact that they're going to be very expensive, and a new very expensive pickup truck maybe isn't the answer on some small and medium-sized farms and even some large ones, but nonetheless, it is a good sign that electric trucks are on the way. Electric tractors are on the way too. Solectrac is available now. At least one NFU member has one, maybe more do. I know NFU members in BC have built their own electric solar tractors, fantastic. On the right-hand side of this screen are some prototype electric tractors that are out there. Again, I'm sensitive to the fact that these are going to be expensive, but nonetheless, they are at least the beginning, perhaps, of a solution in some places. So electrify farm machinery, install on-farm solar arrays, maybe capture methane coming off of manure and run that through biodigesters to get electricity or heat. I think a lot of times things like solar panels get a lot of the press and less exciting things like just insulation and weather stripping don't. But it's really important that we retrofit our farm buildings and our homes so that they're energy efficient and they don't leak. And as we do that, the heating load can be decreased, and maybe we can start heating more with electricity and less with natural gas in places where that's done. And finally, when we build new buildings, because they're going to last for 50, 100, 200 years, we need to make sure that we build them in ways where they will not require fossil fuels. So we need better building codes, net zero housing, passive house, LEED, etc. Another thing we need if we're going to significantly reduce emissions from agriculture is we need independent agrologists. Farmers for Climate Solutions has been very clear in their communication to the government that farmers, both organic and conventional, need good independent advice on how to reduce emissions. National Farmers Union has put that forward to the Minister of Agriculture as well. We've recommended that we need the federal government to hire at least 1,000 public servant agrologists. These independent agrologists are needed because they can place the focus on emission reduction and input reduction, something that agrologists don't do now. Where I am on the prairies, a lot of farmers get their information and support from agronomists, agrologists who work for the people trying to sell inputs. So to some extent, those agrologists are providing support and information, but to some extent, they're serving a sales role. And it's not surprising that we see things like a 4-fold increase in nitrogen fertilizer use in Saskatchewan. If you're getting your soil tested at the place that sells fertilizer, and you're getting your agrology information from the place that sells fertilizer, it's not surprising you're going to use a lot more fertilizer. So people who want to pursue agroecological approaches need access to agrologists. People who want to pursue organic, the same. People who want to pursue low input approaches need those independent public servant agrologists that can help them find ways to reduce input use. Now, just beyond the farm, and still including the farm to some extent, I want to talk about another idea, and that's an idea of food sheds. And we're developing this idea in a forthcoming report that looks back from 2030. The report's called Imagine If, Visions of a Near Zero Emission Food System for Canada. And it takes the viewpoint from 2030 and it looks back over the 2020s and tries to figure out what we did right in order to reduce emissions by 2030. And one of the key ideas is one of food sheds. And just briefly how that would work. For cities where there is agricultural land around them, those cities could buy up or get control of some of that land and then give it over to people who are willing to farm it in sustainable, resilient, low emission ways. Perhaps the cities could organize electric transport vehicles to bring that food into the city, into processing plants, to food hubs. Maybe some of those farms, some of those small scale producers, young farmers, new Canadians, small flock livestock growers, some of those farms in the surrounding food shed could be producing, without using any fertilizers. So there's no emissions from that. Some of them might even have electric tractors, so there's no emissions from that. And when you start to think about that, no input or low input production, maybe no emissions from the on-farm field work, no emissions from the transport of that food to the city. Maybe that food is taken to places in neighborhoods where people can access it through walking and transit, so they don't have emissions from taking their food home. You start to get a glimpse of a food system that is near zero emission. And not all the food for a city could be produced that way, but if some of it was, that would be tremendously important. It would be symbolic. People would start to see zero emission food coming into their city. And this seems like an innovative idea, that cities would somehow take an interest in the land around them and organize that land to supply them with food in ways that were sustainable. But really, we've had about 5,000 years of cities, and for 4,900 of those years, that's exactly how cities work. Cities were supplied by the food sheds around them. So we think that food sheds are both a very practical thing, that they create space for diverse approaches for new farmers to get into farming, but they're also tremendously symbolic. They really advance on a lot of fronts, and food sheds are going to be a really important thing moving forward. Last part of my talk, and I think I'm probably coming up to time here, I'm just going to make a connection between the kinds of emissions and climate solutions I've talked about and net farm income, because we always say that if the farms that take action to reduce emissions are penalized, this just isn't going to go forward. Farmers aren't making a lot of money now, and they cannot be asked to really shoulder the cost of transitioning to low input approaches. But what we've found is there's actually a lot of synergies here, that things that farmers can do to reduce emissions can also increase incomes. So this is a graph of British Columbia gross farm revenue and net farm income. So the black line that goes up is gross farm revenue over the last last 94 years, 1926 until 2020. So the black line goes up over the last almost 1 century. It's adjusted for inflation. So what you're seeing there isn't just inflation, it's actually that farmers are producing more production and the value is going up. And the other thing we've done is we've subtracted farm support payments, farm subsidies. So we've subtracted out the money that flows from taxpayers to farmers through programs like Agri-Invest and Agri-Stability. So the black line is BC farmers' gross revenues from the markets adjusted for inflation. And the gray line that doesn't go up is BC farmers' realized net income from the markets adjusted for inflation. So I'm just going to color in that bottom area so you can see it. The green areas are years of positive realized net farm income from the markets, and the red areas are years of negative net farm income from the markets. Some people see this graph and think it just can't be possible that things are this bad. How could farming even continue in British Columbia? 3 answers. 1, support program payments. There's been a lot of taxpayer money flowed into agriculture in every province of this country. When we add it up, since the farm income crisis really started in the 80s, about $100 billion in total has gone from taxpayers to farmers. So the first part of the answer is how could agriculture continue if net returns were so bad? The first part of the answer is taxpayer funded dollar flows. The second part is off-farm income. A lot of farms are kept afloat through off-farm jobs. And the third part of the answer is increasing debt. Especially over the last 20 years, a huge amount of money has been borrowed and not paid back. Farm debt in Canada is now about $115 billion. So those 3 factors. But what I really want to focus in on here isn't net income. It's the area between those 2 lines, the area between the gross revenue and the net income, because that's the difference between what farmers get when they sell their products and what they have left after they pay their bills. That's what they pay for inputs, their expenses. That's what they pay for fertilizer and veterinary drugs and fuel and farm machinery and etc. What they pay interest on their debt. It's the money they give to Bayer Monsanto, to Nutrien and Agrium, to banks for interest, etc. And you can see that blue area just gets larger and larger and larger. And I'll just put some numbers there. From the end of the Great Depression in BC until the mid-70s, farmers were keeping over 1/3 of every dollar that they made. Starting in the 1970s to today, if you take the average, farmers are keeping about 1% of the money they get from the markets. And again, they couldn't survive if they just had that 1%. So on top of that, there's off-farm income and support payments and increasing debt. But you can see that the amount taken by non-farmers is getting bigger and bigger. And I think what we're seeing here very clearly is farmers have been encouraged to become over-dependent on purchased inputs. Organic farmers are a really great countermodel. Organic farmers are really leading the way in trying to figure out how not to become over-dependent on purchased inputs, although when I see how organic agriculture is developing, people are being encouraged to buy more and more kinds of soil amendments, etc. But for farming in general in BC, it's clear that too much money is flowing out to the people that are supplying inputs. And I'll just show you this in a different way. And this is my last slide before I wrap up. The top graph shows the percentage of the gross revenue dollar that farmers keep. And you can see it was up around 60%. At one point, it falls for several decades and has been around zero or negative in recent decades. And the converse of that, the bottom graph, that's the amount of money from agriculture that non-farmers have been able to extract. And you can see it's been around 100%, and recently it's been above 100%. I once heard it said that the shortest possible history of agriculture is this: non-farmers figuring out ways to make money from farming. And as farmers have become more and more dependent on purchased inputs, others have taken more and more of the wealth created by farmers. But here's where this intersects with emissions reduction. The emissions coming out of agriculture are more or less a function of the inputs we push in. Agriculture doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a startling realization for some. Agriculture does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that because we've had 10,000 years of agriculture. And for the first 9,900 years, it did not affect the atmosphere. It did not affect the climate. Farmers farmed and the atmosphere and the climate did not change. Agriculture does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. What produces greenhouse gas emissions are agricultural inputs. And as farmers in Canada have used more and more inputs, their emissions have gone up. And as farmers have used more and more inputs, the portion of the money they get from the markets has gone down. Their net income and their margins have gone down. So if we go forward in a way where we want to produce fewer emissions and we find ways to use fewer inputs, as we use fewer inputs, the emissions can go down and our margins and net incomes can go up. So if farmers take the lead, if we move to take control of our future around climate change, there are versions of this where input reduction and organic approaches and low input approaches, agroecology, et cetera, can reduce farmers' dependence on inputs and thus increase their net incomes at the same time it decreases their emissions. So that's the end of my talk. Again, for more detail and some background and footnotes and sources and more graphs and all of those things, I'd invite you, if you haven't yet, to have a look at our report from last year, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis. Again, if you're not active on the policy front, I'd invite you to sort of look around and, BC organizations, national organizations that are working on the climate issue and to really get involved. So thank you very much. That's my talk, and I'd be really happy if there was lots of great questions.
Okay, Darrin, thank you so much. Oh, great. Someone has turned the screen off, so that's good. Thank you, Darrin. That was wonderful. A wonderful presentation, and I saw questions rolling in as you were speaking. We now have not quite half an hour for questions. I do have a little bit to review about Q&A for this session and the rest of the day, and a couple other notes, and then we'll get started, everybody. So while I am yammering, you could be thinking about your questions. I want to remind everyone right now that we have decided to continue recording the Q&A. So keep that in mind. Hopefully that doesn't bother anyone, but it would be nice to be able to capture this segment of the session. So that's one thing. Before we do this, I want to remind everyone, I didn't emphasize this very well before, John touched on it. Anytime today, it's not just about socializing if you want to get into a breakout room of your own. If you would like to propose a breakout room topic, we can do that. So this is the first of 4 Q&As today. And for any of those Q&As, certainly for the subsequent ones, I intend to have some other breakout rooms open in case you want to jump into a different topic. You can use the chat to request one of those rooms yourself if you have a specific topic. Hey, does anyone want to talk about online commerce? Does anyone want to talk about slaughter regulations? Anything like that? You can request that directly to John, which will probably be most effective, but also in the main chat feed, and John can set that up. I'll be proposing some. And just as an example, John, if while I'm talking, if you could set up 2 breakout rooms right now, one on livestock in general and one on crop production. So if anyone feels like jumping over there, great. I suspect many of you will hang around to hear what Darrin has to say or ask him questions, but I just wanted to make that livestock and just general crop production. Okay, so having said all of that, how this will work, I've got some questions that I've taken notes on just in case things get quiet. I don't think that'll be the case. And you've heard me ask questions for the last couple months of the podcast. So I'm going to really try and avoid asking questions. There are basically 2 ways that you can submit questions. You can put your hand up, and that's kind of my job. I'll do my best. I see some hands up, so I'm noticing that. I'll do my best to answer, to allow people to ask questions that way. Meanwhile, if you see the lineup for hands is too long, you can submit via chat, and John will be watching that, and he's going to let me know when he's picked out one that he can ask on that person's behalf. That's probably how we'll do it. So 2 different ways. I'm going to say, I saw some questions being asked during the talk, maybe if you're going to, it'd be a good idea to ask them again via chat or put your hand up, just because I'm not, they might be buried now. So that would be my suggestion for that. So I'm gonna start. I see Arzina's hand is up, so we'll try taking a live question that way. And time right now, folks, is 20 to 11. I'm going to probably try and wrap up by about 7 or 6 minutes to 11, something like that. Okay. So Arzina, why don't you take it away with our first question for Darrin?
Thanks so much, Jordan. And thanks, Darrin, for the fantastic presentation. I really liked that point that you made about the need to increase the number of farmers on land. And I know in the chat, a lot of people brought up labor costs as part of the issue around take-home pay and net pay for farmers. So you didn't touch on it, but what about the increase in food costs that might arise from having to move in this direction? Does the NFU or have you thought about like what policy directions we can go in around food prices?
Thanks for the great question, Arzina. And just before I answer it, I just want to make a little disclaimer here because I'm humbled, I think, by some of the knowledge that people are going to have. So I just want to make a disclaimer that I am not a soil scientist and I'm not an organic farmer. So sometimes questions come that are very detailed and production focused, etc. So I'm going to pass on those, and maybe others might want to field them. So getting to the question Arzina asked about how a transformed food system might affect food prices. I don't have the graphs at hand, but what I've done over the years is I've graphed a whole bunch of commodity and product pairs. So wheat and bread, corn and cornflakes, barley and beer, beef and hamburger, and you can kind of come up with the pairs endlessly. And every one of those graphs looks the same. So my low-tech version is across the bottom of the screen, you have the price of wheat, say. And I grew up farming here in Saskatchewan, and I remember when wheat went to $5 a bushel, and it's still about $5 a bushel. So across the bottom of the screen, you have this price of wheat, and then going up like this, you have the price of bread. And beef does this, cattle do this, and beef does that. And what we see all through these commodity and product pairs is processors and retailers taking more and more and more. Just the incredible market power and lack of competition means that these processors and retailers push down the price at the farm gate, simultaneously push up the price in the grocery store, and take more and more of what's in between. You could literally quadruple the price of grain, and it shouldn't show up in any appreciable way in the price of bread, although given the way processors and retailers work, I'm sure they pass on 410% of that price increase to consumers. So we have a policy problem that we need to deal with in parallel, and that is to restrain the capacity of processors and retailers to take the amount of money they're taking so the more can get to the farm, so that higher farm returns don't mean higher grocery store prices.
Thanks, Darrin.
Okay, so I'm going to take another hand. Susanna Klassen, why don't you go ahead?
Great, thanks so much. Thanks for a great presentation, and also that was a great question, Arzina. I don't know everyone here, and I'm not currently a farmer, but I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, and I'm very privileged to be sort of part of this community. I'm going to ask what's probably a fairly unpopular question among some in this group. You brought up so many important solutions with regards to agricultural practices and inputs, but the reality is that a significant proportion of agricultural emissions are from livestock, which is from agriculture. And I just wonder how you deal with that, because I think there are many reasons why livestock are really important parts of agricultural systems. But I think we can't remain sort of credible and legitimate in our analysis if we ignore that huge part of the plot, especially for agricultural emissions in BC. So I just wanted to raise that, and I'm really curious if others have thoughts.
We could do a whole day on livestock, and when I did the graph for BC, I was surprised to see just how large a portion of the emissions are from livestock. That isn't the case in just about any other province. I didn't say a lot about solutions around livestock, and especially cattle, because to some extent, we're working those out. Arzina is one of the co-chairs on our task force at Farmers for Climate Solutions, and the other one is a livestock producer from Saskatchewan named Ian McCreary. And Ian and I were on a phone call yesterday, and we were lamenting the fact that because of data gaps and a lot of unknowns, it's really hard to even answer a basic question like, are whole system life cycle analysis emissions reduced if cattle are finished on grass as opposed to finished in feedlots? And we have some initial answers to that, but a lot depends on when they're born, etc. So I'd like to say more about how we reduce emissions from livestock, but to some extent that's being worked out. Having said that, farmers have taken a lot of steps. Emissions per animal, per kilogram, per pound of beef is going down. But the other thing too is a really short version of the livestock issue is this, that livestock can be emissions problems, but good grazing is a climate solution. And so what we have to do really is we have to make sure there is space, policy space and geographic space and space in the public's mind for good grazing. And we need to maximize the benefits that good grazing have at the same time that we work to reduce emissions. So I worked for many, many years, and if you read the chapters in the tackling report on livestock, you'll just see what a struggle it is. I've worked for many, many years, and it really is like peeling an onion. The quick knee-jerk solutions that people have one way or the other around livestock just aren't the case. The deeper you look into this question, the more nuanced it becomes. And I think we really need those grazing livestock on the landscape, but we also need to sort of be authentic around our attempts to reduce emissions where we can.
Okay, so I know we have at least 3 more questions, and that might take us to the end. We'll see. We can try and squeeze in another one if we can, but I'm going to pass it. I see Annalise and Steve there, but we're going to go over to a chat question. So I'm going to pass it over to John, and he will ask that question.
So we have a question from Rebecca Neen. Darrin, it's also about just the number of steps between farmer and eater. Even if each processor takes a small profit, when there are many, many different stages of disparity, grows hugely. I'd also add that unfortunately, this has led to tons of government support for what's noxiously called value added, instead of reducing the number of steps and points of profit between farmers and eaters. Less of a question, more of a statement.
Yeah, just briefly on that, 100% right. A lot of the discussion with government is around local processing, especially abattoirs. The abattoir issue in BC is huge. If farmers are going to produce in more sustainable, more resilient ways, they need to be able to have access processors and the market. So yeah, we need shorter chains so there's fewer and fewer people taking stuff in the middle. And that idea of food sheds and local processing is one way we can do that.
Okay, so Annalise and or Steve, thanks for your patience. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I understand from what I've been reading lately that when you use nitrogen on soil, you're eroding the soil carbon quite rapidly. I don't know how factual that is, but if that is the case, is that part of the equation when you talk about the reduced impact of reducing nitrogen use? Or are we strictly talking about the production?
Yeah, you've identified another factor that I wasn't specifically pointing at, but you're right. Although it's really complicated. So the point you make is that when you use synthetic nitrogen, you can kind of burn through your carbon stock, which is correct in a way, but it also runs into this contradictory idea that soil organic matter contains carbon, but it also contains a lot of nitrogen. And if you don't have nitrogen to bond with the carbon, you can't actually have soil organic matter. Or to put it another way, if you calculate a certain amount of soil organic matter increase, you also are implicitly thinking that there's going to be a certain amount of nitrogen captured and tied up in that soil organic matter as well. So nitrogen is both a limiting factor in creating soil organic matter, but it's also a destructive factor in destroying soil organic matter. So we need a little more time to sort of sort that all out, but thanks for the question.
Okay, so I'm going to go to another chat question. John, take it away.
Okay, we have a question from Herman Bruns. As an organic vegetable farmer, I would like to get our farm to net zero carbon emissions sooner rather than later. It would seem that offsetting may be my only option. Could you talk about your thoughts on offsets and give advice how to measure CO2 emissions, best ways to offset them, and if there are any companies specializing in agriculture that can certify that process?
So done well, especially if it's on your own farm and you're really, really focused on this, offsetting perhaps can work. If you're, say, planting trees, etc., and really making sure that those trees are nurtured for the long term. But the larger conversation around offsets is very problematic. This maybe it wasn't what you were thinking when you asked the question, but offsets and net zero are a real focus of government and industry. But what they often amount to is releasing carbon from fossil fuel, and that's like 1,000 or 1,000 year or longer emission to the atmosphere, but then offsetting that with capturing carbon in soils or trees, which could only be decades. And so the whole concept of net zero can be problematic. Better if we get closer to actual zero. We can't get all the way there. Things like nitrous oxide and methane are hard to really reduce to zero. But in terms of fossil carbon, we should probably get all the way to zero and rely as little as possible on offsets, especially the kind of corporate and government version of offsets.
Darrin, I'm gonna ask a somewhat related follow-up. I share Herman's concern that on a market garden, it's daunting to think about getting emissions way down, just because of the dominant approach is a lot of bare soil and often a lot of tillage. I mean, even if you're an organic farmer, really being thoughtful about your input use. I failed when I acknowledged our podcast guest interviewers a few minutes ago. I was doing that off the cuff, and I was worried I left one out, and I did. I left out Abra Bryn, who interviewed you for the podcast, Darrin. She actually asked you in the conversation, but then you both got distracted. She asked you what's to be done, like where to strike a balance if you take something like drip irrigation, which is meant to conserve water, which is a noble and very important goal, but generally implies a lot of scorched earth in between rows that are irrigated, right? I don't know if that's too technical for you to answer. I guess I just want to highlight it as one of the challenges facing like intensive veggie production, which is, I think, sort of what Herman is getting at.
Yeah, thanks for the follow-up, Jordan. Just to follow up, I don't mean to answer a question with the question, but is the idea here that those soils are going to continue to be net sources of carbon because they have a lot of bare patches?
That's one of my concerns. Yeah. Also just destroying soil's structure by running machinery and whatnot through dry areas. Yeah. But certainly not building soil carbon when you've got, little skinny row irrigated with very concentrated drip and then a lot of dry soil in between. Seems like not a good situation for the goals that you've outlined today. And yet, like, there's a reason we're doing that.
Thanks for that clarification. So in that case, if you have a part of your operation that is releasing soil carbon, I'm sure people are doing as much as they can to minimize that. In that case, you could offset that maybe with better grazing somewhere, or even trees. Offsetting soil carbon emissions with trees and better grazing it's at least soil carbon for soil carbon. And so I think all you could really do there is farm a different part of the area better in order to offset the, soil carbon being released one place and soil carbon increasing in another. Where, just to clarify my previous point, where offsetting becomes problematic and to some extent I think dishonest is when soil carbon gains are used to offset fossil fuel emissions. That's the version of offsetting that can be quite negative.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. And I mean, one thing that comes to mind based on your response is like there are writers like John Jevons who has argued that like one approach is to be thoughtful about just how much of your acreage is devoted to a certain kind of crop that happens to be a little more destructive, and just simply accepting that in a whole market garden, being more thoughtful about percentage devoted to different kinds of crops if your margins allow for that. Anyway, folks, I think we'll wrap it up just to give everyone a chance for a break. Darrin, thank you so much for the time you've given us today and for your thought-provoking presentation. Real quick, is there anything else you want to say, Darrin, before you say goodbye?
Yeah, just encourage everyone, in addition to the sort of production work that they're doing, to get involved on the policy side if they can, and just advance collectively in the political sphere some solutions for agriculture.
Okay, thank you very much, Darrin.